Good afternoon, everybody. And it's so nice to hear the warm murmur of conversation, especially on a chilly, wet day. I can't imagine a nicer place to be than together, preparing for another conversation, which I'm honored to be a part of. I'm Anne Collins Goodyear, co-director of the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's discussion, Visions of Antiquity, Thomas Jefferson, James Bowdoin III, and the Role of the Antique in the Early Republic. Our program is offered in conjunction with the museum's current exhibition, Antiquity and America, the Ancient Mediterranean and the United States, on view until February 5th. This exhibition explores the appeal of Greco-Roman antiquity for American collectors from the latter part of the 18th century until the present day. This afternoon, we are delighted to be joined by Sean Burris, Curator of Antiquity and America, and Emily Johnson, Associate Curator at Monticello. Through their conversation this afternoon, which I will have the pleasure of moderating, Sean and Emily will speak to the friendship shared by James Bowdoin III and President Thomas Jefferson and its implications for the visual arts. Both dedicated to the Republican vision represented by the fledgling democracy of the United States, Bowdoin and Jefferson each recognized the important intersection represented by education, art, and the political experiment being conducted with the American Republic. Just as Bowdoin made possible the educational institution of Bowdoin, founded in 1794, so Jefferson envisioned the University of Virginia, established 25 years later in 1819. And both men valued works of art that visually enshrined the values they shared. These connections, forged by bonds of culture, politics, and class, play an important role in Antiquity and America, as Sean and Emily will discuss. Emily Johnson is an assistant curator at Monticello, the historic home of Thomas Jefferson in Charlottesville, Virginia, where she has worked since 2013. She received her master's degree from the Williams College Graduate Program in the History of Art and her BA from the University of Virginia. Sean Burris, the curator of America and Antiquity, the United States and the Ancient Mediterranean, and editor of the electronic catalog of the same title, published alongside this exhibition, is the museum's former Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral curatorial fellow and interim curator. Sean received his PhD from Duke University and his BA from the University of North Carolina. During his tenure here at Bowdoin, Sean co-curated From Assyria to America and co-founded North by Northwest, a consortium of Northeastern museums stewarding ancient Assyrian reliefs from the Northwest Palace of King Ashurnasirpal II. As we shall have an opportunity to discuss further today, Emily Johnson was a valuable partner in research related to Antiquity and America and was an important contributor to the electronic catalog that accompanied the exhibition. In a recent interview published in Minerva magazine, Emily and Sean had an opportunity to discuss their collaboration on research related to the importance of antiquity in the early American Republic. We are delighted that they are able to join us today to further share their insights. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sean Burris and Emily Johnson. So So as I mentioned, I have the pleasure of moderating this afternoon's conversation. I've had some opportunity to talk with Sean and Emily about some of these selections of artwork that will enliven our discussion. And I'm really pleased that they have chosen to highlight two portraits that are very special to us here at Bowdoin. Both of these portraits were painted by Gilbert Stuart, who incidentally was the first person to catalog our collection. That's a different story. Perhaps we'll touch on it later today, because that story actually does have some intersection with the portrait of Thomas Jefferson that you see in front of you, painted between about 1805 and 1807, and as well as the portrait on the left of James Bowdoin. These were portraits that Bowdoin commissioned when he was appointed by Thomas Jefferson, the minister plenipotentiary to the court of Spain in 1804, a post that he actually assumed from Paris, interestingly enough. And I think in and of themselves, these two portraits made by probably the premier artist and portraitist of his era already begin to give us some sense that these two gentlemen, Thomas Jefferson and James Bowdoin, were individuals who understood something about the significance of art, its opportunity to make a political statement. But I think, as we will see in a moment, this is really the tip of the iceberg. And on this note, Sean, I actually want to turn to you, if I may, to begin our conversation. We know that even before these portraits were undertaken, that Bowdoin had already been in touch with Jefferson about a proposed gift of yet another work of art, which actually features in our exhibition a marble sculpture that we now know to be of Ariadne, which was not actually understood at the time that Bowdoin proffered this gift to represent Ariadne. I think he believed it represented another influential politician. So I think I will turn it over to you to say a little bit more about that piece and its broader political and cultural significance.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you, Anne, and thank you also, Emily, for joining us, but more than anything, being a conversation partner for the last year and a half as we developed this exhibition and had this collaboration. I warn you all in advance, Emily and I have been having this conversation for a year and a half now. So if we, for example, if we slip into saying TJ and JB3 and JB2 and Thomas Jefferson, James Bowdoin III, that's how much we've been talking. We've had to abbreviate some of our conversations. But when we thought tonight about where to begin the conversation, it really does begin with this missive, this letter that James Bowdoin III writes to Thomas Jefferson. After he receives in 1804, Thomas Jefferson appoints him minister plenipotentiary to Spain. Which is a fancy way of saying he's the foreign minister for Jefferson's government to Spain, which the U.S. is in sort of protracted discussions with, disagreements with about the Louisiana Purchase, and there's tension between the French, the Spanish, and the English and America. It's a very complex relationship that James Bowdoin is thrust into the middle of. But on the occasion of that appointment, he writes Jefferson this letter, which you see a copy of it in James Bowdoin III's letter books, which are in special collections and archives. And after going on about the politics of the situation, he turns his attention to art. And this is kind of the first hint of kind of some of the kindred spirit that the two of them share, the overlaps in philosophy and approach. And the first thing he does is he says, I know you like art too. Let me be your agent in Europe. I'm not a scholar of ancient art, but I've seen the old masters, and we'll come back to that in a minute. I've seen the originals, and I know something about it. And if you'll permit me, I'm happy to help you purchase art. So he already knows by reputation that Jefferson like himself, as we'll discuss, is someone who's actively engaged in collecting art and the ancient world. But along with that offer of his services, in the same letter, he offers him this gift, and we see it here. It is this sculpture of Ariadne that he describes as a handsome piece of modern sculpture, and it is in fact a piece of modern sculpture. I'll get to that in a minute. A Cleopatra that's a copy of one that's currently in Paris, she's right about, that had previously been at the Vatican, in the Belvedere Palace. And he describes it as really a beautiful piece of marble, well worked, and he tells us a little bit about the history. He intends Jefferson to place it in his hall, but mentions that he got it ostensibly from through the hands of a French commissary who was on hand when Napoleon looted the Vatican and took the sculptures from the Vatican to the Louvre in Paris and put them on display there. Napoleon, being Napoleon, got the original, which we'll see in a minute. Napoleon got the real Ariadne. This French commissary apparently got this copy that had been in the collection or the papal apartments of Clement XIV, who was a pope in the 1760s. And so that's already a really interesting history. We see here the original. This is a wonderful photograph, early photograph of the Ariadne when it has returned to the Vatican. It's back in the Vatican now. Napoleon's long gone. And one of the first things they do is repatriate the vast majority of the Vatican's priceless, amazing antiquities and reinstall them. But this is a photograph of the original, a very dramatic, beautiful photograph by early French photographer Charles Soulier. And you can see when you look at the two that it really is a pretty good copy. It's a pretty faithful copy. Bowden's not wrong in describing it as a good piece of sculpture. There are some simplifications in the drapery. It's reduced. It's about a half-size copy of the original and some minor differences in pose. But it's a pretty faithful reproduction on the whole. And it's remarkable. One of the things that's so important for it to bear in mind here is that this piece of sculpture, as we'll come to see, at the time that it's offered to Jefferson in 1805, is really one of a handful of marble sculptures in the country. It's a bigger gift then than we might think of it today. It's a rarity in the States. So, Emily can expand a little on how Jefferson received this gift.
Thanks so much, Sean and Anne. It's been just delightful to be here. And Jefferson must have been, I can only imagine what he thought when he opens this letter from James Bowdoin, who he hasn't met in person. He knew James Bowdoin's father a little bit. They had corresponded a little bit. But Jefferson had decided to make him this important representative of the United States to Spain. And then he receives, pretty much the best thank you gift and the best thank you note ever. Delighted, I'm looking forward to it. Let me help you get some more art. And hey, by the way, here's a sculpture. So Jefferson is in the president's office. He's coming back and forth to Monticello somewhat during his presidency, generally in the summer months. And so at some point, probably by the end of 1805, early 1806, the sculpture comes to Monticello, where it is installed in Jefferson's entrance hall, which for those of you who know Monticello, you may know that Jefferson was basically on a 40-year construction campaign. He built up, he tore down, he built up, out, and more. And so when this comes to Monticello, it comes into a very recently finished entrance hall. And it is located in a really peculiar spot, especially, Virginia's a little warmer than Maine, right? But, we're right here, work around in, she's right in front of the fireplace. Why would you put a sculpture in front of a fireplace? This is the only heating source in this room. It's a big room with tall ceilings. We don't know why, except that it's extremely prominent and it looked really good, which if you know Thomas Jefferson a little bit, you know that sometimes that was the deciding factor. But we know this because his granddaughter at his death draws an annotated floor plan where she locates the sculpture in front of the fireplace. And there's also a visitor account of the Marquis de Lafayette coming to Monticello in 1824 on his return, his triumphal return trip to the United States. He comes to Monticello for dinner. It's a big dinner. There's a lot of people. And so the grandchildren talk about having to move the sculpture to accommodate the crowds. But in this, we learn from one of Jefferson's granddaughters, Ellen, that she calls the statue the only sculpture in the collection. And she recognizes Jefferson had a large art collection. We'll be talking about that some more pretty soon. But he had busts. This was the only object that his granddaughter, Ellen, who is trained in the classics, she has a very, very forward-looking education for a woman, and she knows that this is a sculpture. This is an important aspect. And why this is so appealing is that Jefferson has been after classical sculpture for decades at this point. On the left, you have a 1771 list of a gallery proposal for Monticello. He's 28 years old. This is before he has a house, before he has the first house, it's before he has the second house. It's before he's really much of anything, and yet he's listed out, it's basically, there are 13 sculptures on the list, I believe, and it's kind of your top 13 of classical sculptures known to elite Western aficionados at this time. You've got the Apollo Belvedere, you've got the Venus de Medici, you've got the messenger with the thorn in his foot, and Jefferson has this grand ideal for these objects to be at Monticello, but it's unrealized. You know, it's only realized through Ariadne, and I think that, you know, this Ariadne becomes a symbol of Americans' ambition and a symbol of this important connection between supporters and promoters of the arts in this country. And through that, she becomes a really important touch point between Jefferson and Bowdoin.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, that's, both Bowdoin and Jefferson understood, you know, the significance of a piece of marble like this in 1805 in the United States. And I think, you know, for Bowdoin to give this from his collection, it's the only piece of marble sculpture that I know of that Bowdoin ever owned, and it turns into the only piece of marble sculpture that Jefferson ever owned. It's a very significant gift. So when we were thinking about this exhibition and the genesis of the Bowdoin collection as a college and the role of James Bowdoin III in building that, this was a piece that was high on the list of things we needed to represent in the exhibition, let's say. And so you will see online and in the galleries a virtual model of this piece of sculpture. And it was a really fun exercise. This is the second kind of virtual loan that the museum has done. Previously, we did something with the British Museum for Assyria to America for much the same reason. But it was fun to work on this model with David Israel, who's in the audience tonight. Shout out to David, who did the heavy lifting and hard work. We went down to Monticello a little over a year ago and had early mornings on the mountaintop when nobody else was there. And David scanned the model using these wonderful 3D scanners that the museum acquired just prior to the pandemic. And you know, did all the hard work while everybody from Monticello watched, and while I walked around the grounds, took in the sunrise. And then, you know, when we came back, that was when, you know, David put the finishing touches on this beautiful model. You can scan a QR code using your phone there and access it on your mobile device if you want. But it allows the visitor to interact with this piece of sculpture. And then Emily and I were able to build a narrative around that too by annotating the model, by telling the story of Ariadne, a Cretan princess who was abandoned on the island of Naxos in ancient myth by Theseus and then married by Dionysus. And you know, talk about also the re-identification of Ariadne, because when Bowdoin gets the sculpture, as you saw in the letter, he calls it Cleopatra, and that's down to a snake bracelet that she wears And obviously Cleopatra is said to have committed suicide by an asp. And that's where that association comes with. And for a long time, this was acquired in 1512 and installed. The original sculptures acquired in 1512 that you see in the Soulier photograph again there, is acquired in 1512 and installed in the Vatican. And for a long time, up until the late 18th century, it is thought to be Ariadne. So still on tours of the Vatican, you would encounter this even in Bowden's day. But it had also been corrected at this point. I mean, described as Cleopatra, but also by this point it had been corrected to Ariadne. And Jefferson, one of the things I love about their correspondence is Jefferson is too polite to correct Bowden. He very quickly realizes that it's not Cleopatra because he has in his library a copy of Napoleon's publication of the Louvre where it's described as Ariadne. But he never writes back to Bowden and says, actually. So that was a tactful, that shows his politic nature, right? And, one of the things, I think the last thing to point out about this is one of the reasons, why do we have this as a virtual loan? Why are we so fortunate to have not only this on virtual loan from Monticello, but another wonderful piece of art that you'll see later on, 2 loans from Monticello in the exhibition. So I'll turn it over to Emily to wrap that up.
Well, and this is actually a great place to see the asp bracelet that so frequently contributed to her misidentification. Well, we've actually, as Bowden and Jefferson interacted at several different points during their lives, so have the Bowdoin College Museum of Art and Monticello. And so we actually, we were planning to send Ariadne to Bowdoin in 1990, I think it was the end of 1993, for an exhibition. It must have been was it the bicentennial exhibition?
It was the bicentennial of the founding of the college. And there may be people in the audience who know something about
Wonderful.
that particular exhibition who may actually have coordinated it and edited the related catalog. So we're delighted that Catherine Watson, in fact, is with
The
us.
Legacy of James Bowdoin III, which was a critical publication in the research for this exhibition.
So it was the end of 1993, and 1993 was a really big year at Monticello as well, but we were, the art shippers were at Monticello in the entrance hall. She weighs 600 pounds. She is quite something to move. We don't like to move her very often. I'm sure they didn't like to move her when the Marquis de Lafayette showed up either, but, and so she was being packed up, and unfortunately, these are very fragile, as are these, as are toes. And unfortunately, in the packing, some of her fingers and toes were broken. And so the loan was, at that point, then called, and we did not end up sending Ariadne to Bowdoin at that point because she had just been, she had just been conserved. And this is not the first time. Ariadne has had Ariadne's fingers have had a very tumultuous history. They've had a tough time, and we see evidence for earlier repairs. And so when Anne and Sean reached out to us in probably early 21 about lending Ariadne, we had just had her reconserved again, and she'd had baths, and we'd gotten the tobacco smoke off of her, and we'd replaced the thumb that had been missing since 1928, and we stuck all of her fingers back on and her toes back on. And so we, sort of were like, oh, she's so pristine and lovely in our entrance hall. Can we do something else? And so I've got to thank Sean and Anne for your openness and your willingness to experiment with a different way of presenting Ariadne and of sharing her with all of you.
Yeah, no, it became really a great collaboration in the end. So I hope everyone will enjoy the virtual model as well.
Well, one of the things that I think you've each brought out in your comments, but that I'd like to delve into a little bit more deeply, is the clear appreciation that both James Bowdoin III and Thomas Jefferson had for classical antiquity. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about the degree to which each of these gentlemen was representative of their era in terms of understanding the relevance of classical antiquity in the late 18th century, especially as the United States is building this new democratic system, and to what degree you feel that both their understanding of classical antiquity intellectually, and perhaps their commitment to finding ways to expose audiences to it was in fact transformative at that moment in time. And Emily, having started with Sean previously, maybe I'll turn the floor to you.
Thank you so much. So let me move. Sean has turned me on to a fabulous resource, a scholar named Daniel Kilbride, who talks about how rare it was for Americans to go abroad in the early Republic. Kilbride, I think, gives a figure that up until the War of 1812, at the maximum, it's about 2,000 Americans per year who are making the crossing. And so we did a little math. I used a calculator because I am an art historian. And we've realized that that's less than 0.1% of the American population at this time. So it's a really tiny number of people are going abroad. And for those who do make the trip, Jefferson's experience is by far the most typical. He goes for business. He goes because he is representing the United States. Other people go for mercantile reasons. Some go for leisure, and we'll hear about that in a bit. But Jefferson, while he's there, he's representing the United States, but he's killing time in a lot of bookshops. He's killing times in galleries and collections. He's really absorbing the sights. And while he's there, even early, he arrives in the middle of 1784 in Paris. And in 1785, he writes to James Madison, who's basically his best friend, and he describes himself as an enthusiast on the subject of the arts, and he claims that this is something he is not ashamed of. He loves art, and he is proud of it. And he also, in a similar letter from about the same time, he describes himself as a savage from the mountains of America. So you get the sense that he's fashioning himself as this provincial who is coming into this cultural, just this amazing cultural capital. And you can see him kind of playing with this sort of, the center and the provinces in these depictions of himself. These are the earliest depictions of Jefferson that we have. On the left, we have a 1786 portrait where he's depicted at sort of the height of aristocracy. There's frills, there's powder. This is not a way, there's a classical sculpture in the background, and we don't really know. She hasn't really been identified. That's, the work is still ongoing. We don't see Jefferson like this very often, and I think he became uncomfortable with presenting himself like this because we much more frequently see him, as you do on the right, in the Trumbull, which is meant to depict him at 1776. It's meant to depict him at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but was done in Paris in 1788. And so this is much more how we see him, kind of, wide-eyed, more casual, more informal, which was a persona that he really cultivated. But while he's in Paris, as I said, he's seeing things. He writes and gushes over works like the David. He travels to the Netherlands, he travels in Germany, and throughout he writes about what he sees. He says he doesn't like the red blobs of Rubens. He likes Adrian van der Werf, he likes Carlo Dolci. But he's also, as he's seeing, he's also collecting. And these are two examples of paintings. They don't survive in our collections. These are things that we have been able, through various research efforts, to identify. They were probably sold in Boston in 1833. They may be lurking darkly and dirtily in your attic, your guest bathroom. If you see anything like this, I would love to know about it. But you have this idea that he's collecting examples of classical work to bring back to Monticello, to bring back to America. And I think that's a nice parallel between his experience in France and James Bowden's experience in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. So if Jefferson is in rarefied company already as one of 2,000 Americans, at most, a year who are making the transatlantic crossing. Bowden is even more rarefied company in being among the very few Americans who could afford to go for pleasure. go for leisure. He actually goes to Europe 3 times during his life. The first time is in 1770 as a young man. After withdrawing from Harvard on account of ill health, he's sent to Oxford. The transatlantic journey supposedly being good for one's health, although anybody who had, that's coming from someone who never did it probably. One of the curious things, we start to see his proclivities already at this time. He writes a letter home to Papa Bowdoin, JB2, saying, really excited letter. You can imagine getting this letter from any undergraduate writing home and he says, I've taken up dancing, and I've taken up fencing, and I've taken up French. And, there's some of the Francophile leanings already. And obviously, for those who don't know, the Bowdoin family, originally French Huguenots. Pierre Baudouin was the first to immigrate to the U.S. So his dad gets that letter and writes back, you really should consider courses in economics, something practical here. Obviously, the family wealth is established on Dad's not exactly pleased that he's leaning so heavily into the pleasure aspect. He goes home briefly, and then in 1773 he goes again, and he goes on the Grand Tour. He begins in Naples, and he travels through Italy, goes to Rome, and up through Bologna, Florence, even into southern France. And he's recalled in 1775 after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. His father is an important revolutionary figure. And he returns to Boston. But we know already that this trip on the Grand Tour was very seminal for him. And he starts to collect. And for sure we know at least this portrait was a young James Bowdoin painted by an unknown Italian artist while he was on the Grand Tour. So this is probably one of James Bowdoin III's earliest commissions of artworks. And we also know that he left with his sister when he departed in 1775, an unspecified group of paintings that she was going to send home at a later date. We know about those travels because of the travel diary of Ward Nicholas Boylston, who at the time was the same age as Bowdoin, but we only have this painting also by Gilbert Stuart, much later in life. Ward Nicholas Boylston, another Boston Brahmin family who traveled with Bowdoin for the Italian part of his journey. And he recounts all of their adventures in Italy in a fair amount of detail, from their trip to Pompeii to see the archaeological ruins, from their time at Vesuvius and the sulfurous atmosphere that they encountered there, to a dinner they had with Lord William Hamilton, who, if you were British or ostensibly a British subject at this time, he was the British diplomat to the court at Naples, and you paid homage. You paid a visit to him. Critical about that is Lord Hamilton was among the first and most prominent collectors of antiquities among the British, and it's his collection of Greek vases that was sold to the British Museum that really puts the collecting of Greek vases on the map. So this dinner with Lord Hamilton, one has to imagine that Bowdoin saw there and maybe caught some of the collecting bug from him. It's hard to tease out where all of Bowdoin's paintings come from, but based on what we know the art he acquires, I'm very confident to say that among the 72 works and 140 drawings, 72 paintings and 140 drawings that he leaves to Bowdoin in his bequest of 1812, a good number of them are acquired through his travels to Europe, beginning with his earliest travels as a young man on the Grand Tour. Among those paintings is this John Smibert copy after a painting by Nicolas Poussin, French painter, one of the preeminent in the grand historical tradition, that shows the continents of Scipio. Now, this painting illustrates another source of Bowdoin's paintings. He probably acquired this from the studio of John Smibert. John Smibert was a Scottish artist who immigrated to America to found actually a school in the Bahamas.
Bermuda.
Mm-hmm. And that enterprise is aborted, and he lands in Boston, and he sets up shop there for the rest of his life. And he's an early American artist, a very prominent in in training generations of American artists. And it's works like these in his studio that introduced American artists to classical themes, the role of classical antiquity and art in Europe in this time. And then later on, when this is gifted to Bowdoin College in 1812, 1813, becomes a model for Bowdoin students for generations to come, both of European art, of antiquity, but also of the morals that can be drawn from paintings like this. Bowdoin also collects on a smaller scale. These are in the exhibition, and we know he had this group of prints, and there's about a dozen of them, in his drawing room. And here, by purchasing these prints by Johann Faber, which are after a set of works by Rubens, of ancient busts, of ancient worthies, prominent senators, orators, authors like Homer. He's following a well-established European and particularly British aristocratic model of surrounding oneself with the eminent, the worthies of both antiquity and the present, something Jefferson does as well. In the end, among Bowdoin's collection, and here I just share a few examples of the works in the collection, I would say about 1/3 of the works in his collection have some sort of theme derived from the ancient Mediterranean, from the choice of Hercules, this lovely Taddeo Zucchero drawing, to a copy of Titian's Venus and Adonis. And then in the bottom corner, that's the original Titian, Danae and the Golden Cupid. There are a number of Titian versions of this, and a lot of copies, including a copy at Monticello, as well as a copy that James Bowdoin III had and was bequested to Bowdoin College. And this is just a curious turn I'll throw out there. We no longer have this painting. You'd think that Bowdoin's bequest was untouchable, and certainly that's how we regard it today. It's such an important legacy. But in 1850, the Board of Overseers thought that this was too sexualized a motif, and it was offensive to the tastes of New England in this time period, and it was sold at auction. And we know who originally purchased it, but we lost sight of Bowdoin's copy after that, and we haven't figured out where that copy may be to this day. There are about 5 of the 72 paintings that he donated that were sort of quietly done away with. Although not so quietly, students in the Bowdoin Orient really protested that decision if you go back. But this slide is also a great reminder of that transformational aspect that you mentioned, Anne, because I do think it's important to note that Bowdoin, in his own way, in donating this really sizable collection, had to be one of the top dozen art collections in the early Republic, to a college institution, created its own sort of transformational impact and legacy that, we're still here over 200 years later talking about this evening. Obviously, Jefferson as well had sort of a transformational role that Emily can talk to us about.
Definitely, thanks. And, great time to get a frog in your throat, right? Working through it. So Jefferson, once back, Jefferson took on a pretty active role encouraging American artists to draw inspiration from antiquity, but in the effort of creating an American style. He was really involved with a group based in Philadelphia called the Society for Artists of the United States. That's a really fun thing to try to say fast, like 3 times together. But the Society for Artists of the United States was an artist-led organization that kind of broke out of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, PAFA, that still exists. And they elected Jefferson president. It was a very honorary, kind of a rubber stamp position in 1812. But they were very concerned about the emergence of American art. And they wanted to promote art that would define American independence, American liberty, that would sort of show American glory. And one of the ways that they were doing that, and people, some of these pieces are a little bit earlier, were by using classical references, but situating them in a very American context. So you have liberty here in the form of the goddess of youth, a very lovely form of the goddess of youth. But Jefferson's most significant contribution to the American landscape and to American sort of visual culture writ large is probably through architecture. And Jefferson had a quote for public buildings. Jefferson he says, "I should prefer the adoption of some one of the models of antiquity which have had the approbation of thousands of years. So for public buildings, he's looking for buildings that have permanence, that have been, that have all of, good taste, judgment, permanence, again, in the idea of this, somewhat experimental government in early America. And so one of the earliest buildings that we see is the Virginia State Capitol in Richmond, depicted here, lonely and beautiful on a hill by Benjamin Henry Latrobe in the mid-1790s. And then you can see the side view of the building at the top right. So this is based on the Maison Carrée, seen here on the left, which Jefferson described as, quote, one of the most beautiful, if not the most beautiful, and precious morsel of architecture left to us by antiquity. And we were just having a conversation. So Jefferson doesn't see this building until 1787. He's sending plans back to Virginia in 1785. So this is a building that he knows through prints, through the good taste of others, even before he gets a chance to experience it himself. And like Ariadne, you'll see there are some slight differences between the building in Virginia, seen here in 1865, versus the original. The porch is a little bit less deep. Virginia artisans swapped out those Corinthian column capitals for Ionic, a little bit easier to carve. But the idea is the same. And Americans would recognize this. This is a temple. This is an important building. And this is the type of building that spread throughout the United States in the early 19th century. This was state capitals. These were courthouses. They were jails sometimes, schools, churches. It becomes distilled through American classicism, but this becomes many Americans' first-hand, tangible encounter with the classical. And the tie-in here, to bring it back to the exhibition, is Clarisseau. Charles-Louis Clarisseau, who was a French historian and architect, that's who Jefferson looked to say, Clarisseau, what should I use as a model for the Virginia State House? And Clarisseau's like, I gotcha. I've got a great idea. Let's do the Maison Carrée. And so it's Clarisseau who provides the drawings. It's Clarisseau who helps with the physical model, which exists at the Virginia State Capitol building. It's a wonderful artifact. And it's to Clarisseau that Jefferson is indebted for giving these Virginians this firsthand look at classicism so that they know what to do. And Jefferson feels very beholden to Clarisseau, and he wants to get him a present. Later comes the nice thank you gift from James Bowdoin. Well, Jefferson wants a nice thank you gift to Clarisseau. And so when Jefferson is in Nîmes in 1787, he sees a bronze Roman ascos in the collection of a local antiquarian. And he becomes really intrigued by the form. And so he asks someone in Nîmes to make him a wooden model of the vessel. He goes back to Paris. Something happens. He doesn't get the model. He has to settle on giving Clarisseau like a lovely silver coffee urn. But that model sticks in his mind. And 2 years later, he's preparing to come back to the United States. He writes back down to Nîmes, or actually I think he makes William Short go do it, which, that's a whole other topic of conversation. But William Short gets another model, sends it to Jefferson. Jefferson brings it back to the United States, and then about 10 years later has Philadelphia silversmiths make the silver ascos. And what I love about this object is that it's an American take on a classical object based on a model, and then it's used. Jefferson's family describes this object as the duck. They call it the silver duck, and they claim that they used it to drink hot chocolate out of. So it's this wonder, this is not set on a shelf as an icon or a relic. This was in daily life. This was an active use. And I love that bringing in these classical elements into a really practical use.
Yeah, this is the other loan that we're so grateful to have from Monticello, and in many ways, it's even more powerful than the Ariadne in the sense that here you have an American founder, Jefferson, creatively engaging with antiquity, using a French artist, Souche, to then provide inspiration to American craftsmen and artists in Philadelphia, and so it all kind of ties together that milieu that they're working in, inspired by antiquity. And there is one other instance I want to address in the exhibition of Jefferson being kind of at the center of this triangular relationship between America, French artists, and antiquity, and that is the commission of the first sculpted portrait of George Washington, which is commissioned by the Virginia State Assembly in 1784. 1784. And initially, they asked Charles Willson Peale if he could maybe give it a go. Charles Willson Peale is one of the few American artists who's actually in America at this time. Benjamin West has already set up shop in London, never to return. Alston, I think, is abroad. So Peale takes a crack at it, makes 5 studies, drawings of Washington, and they kind of politely say, okay, we're going to look elsewhere. And it's this moment where we see that American ambition and American arts are not quite at the same level yet. And we'll come back to that. So the Virginia State Assembly writes to Thomas Jefferson, one of their own, who's over in France at the time, and says, the governor writes and says, can you help us with this commission? He says, I got just the guy for you. And just like Clarice said about Nimes. Houdon is the leading French sculptor of the period. Why? I mean, he's renowned across, on either side of the Atlantic, well known. And Jefferson approaches him to take on the George Washington bust. Shares with him the Peale drawings, because originally the idea is maybe he could do this remotely, but as we all know, remote work is only partly successful. Houdon says, no, I've got to go see Washington in person. And he travels to Mount Vernon. This is in Washington's semi-retirement, and he takes a life cast of Washington and also produces a terracotta bust. Goes back to France, begins working on this commission. And the most important aspect about this, so you'll see this bronze bust in the exhibition, is that there was a lively debate, it represents a lively debate in America at this time point about the role of antiquity. So Houdon initially thinks that, Washington is this hero of the Revolution at this point. He's portrayed as a modern Cincinnatus, the Roman general who after, victory in battle laid down his arms rather than take up the reins of empire. And he's the modern incarnation of Cincinnatus. And Houdon says, just as we do in Europe, it makes sense to portray Washington as an ancient. And so this bust is Houdon working out that idea. It shows Washington with a military cloak draped over his shoulder and a Roman blouse and this wide leather strap across his chest that probably would have supported the sword of a general. And they go back and forth. Various parties are writing back and forth about, is classical really the right guise to show Washington in? Ultimately, Washington himself weighs in, and he is the deciding factor and says, no, I want to be portrayed as a contemporary. And so that's what, in the end, you see here the resulting sculpture in marble that Houdon produced that's still to this day in the Virginia State Capitol, of Washington portrayed as a general. With reference, though, still to antiquity worked in the bound fasces to the left, which is a symbol of Roman power, the unification of power under a single authority, that Washington rests his left arm on. So, I mentioned that ambition and American arts not being quite in line when Peale takes a crack at Washington. One of the next most important portraits sculpted portraits of Washington that exists is Horatio Greeno's commission by Congress in 1832. Gets the commission to work out this bust. And Horatio Greeno, to my mind, is the first American sculptor who really can go toe-to-toe with the Europeans of the day in terms of matching ambition with artistic talent and ability. Horatio Greeno takes up the challenge, and he leans into that classical guise. So you see here a bust that may have been part of that process, or may have been part of the earlier process of Greeno working himself up to this commission that everyone kind of knew was in the works. And you see Washington, this is, to my mind, one of the most beautiful of a series of busts of Washington in classical guise by Greeno. Others exist at the Met and the National Gallery of Art. But ultimately, the resulting sculpture, which is today in the Museum of American History, is a very controversial, amazing, over life-size sculpture that not only portrays Washington in the guise of the ancient, but this portrays him as a god, as Zeus. This is the deification of Washington at this point after his death. And it was incredibly divisive because it's also semi-nude Washington, which really raised a lot of eyebrows at the time. So Greenough was, I really love Greenough. One of the first to, build on what Audun had done, take up the charge of the classical, and cement it in American sculpture.
Well, Sean and Emily, you both have done a wonderful job, I think, of demonstrating the transformative impact that classical antiquity had on the minds of Jefferson and Bowdoin, and in turn, their transformative impact in terms of using perhaps the vocabulary that classical antiquity provided to help describe this new political experiment of a democracy, the concept taken from ancient Greece, republic, notion of senators, which of course is developed in Rome. And Emily, you also have suggested to us that the recourse to the language of classical antiquity may also have helped to symbolically enshrine this new republic with the veneer of temporal survival. I love that phrase, the approbation of thousands of years. But as we all recognize, the democracy that was developed in the 18th century, the republic that was developed at that time, was not as entirely representative as we might have hoped. And in fact, we know that the public was defined in a very narrow fashion. It was defined to be male. It was defined to be white. And I think this brings us to an incredibly important topic, the final topic that we'll explore in the formal part of our conversation, and that is the question of race and its role in the American Republic, and the question of the way that this vocabulary of antiquity fits with that concept of race, whiteness, and of course, blackness, and the question of slavery. Sean, I'd like to turn the floor to you as we undertake this important question.
In the development of this exhibition, one of the things that really surprised me was the extent to which Jefferson and Bowdoin's stories and the history of the families, ostensibly so much a story of elite white males interacting with the ancient world, could actually shed light on or be brought to bear on other histories of antiquity in America and other experiences of it. One of the points of contact, actually, between the Bowdoins and Jefferson is the story of Phillis Wheatley. Phillis Wheatley is born in Africa, kidnapped, enslaved in the Massachusetts household of the Wheatleys, and she is one of the country's first black authors and poets. In 1773, while she is enslaved in the Wheatley household, she publishes a volume of her own poetry. And what that poetry reveals to us is, first of all, it's published in London. It couldn't find a American publisher. What that poetry reveals to us in the first instance is that she was incredibly deeply schooled and knowledgeable of the ancient Mediterranean world, ancient Mediterranean literature. Her poetry, and not only in composition but in content as well, makes reference to ancient figures, ancient form, including the first poem of her volume, which is dedicated to Maecenas, who is someone probably nobody in here has heard of, even though I was trained in Greek and Roman classics and antiquity, I hadn't really heard of. It's an obscure figure, so it reveals the depth of her knowledge. Maecenas was a advisor of Octavian and sort of unofficial cultural minister in Rome and patron of poetry in the first century before the Common Era. So already the depth of her knowledge is reaching deep into Greek and Roman history, not for the obvious candidates, but for some obscure ones as well. What I love, though, about Phyllis Wheatley is she's the first kind of recorded instance of a Black American reaching for the world of the ancient Mediterranean as a way to contest the dominant system of racism and slavery in the United States. You can see in lines 37 and on there, she makes a reference to Terence, and her poetry is inspired by Byron, and so it's difficult to read at times, but her basic point is that Terence, who is an African historian, born in Libya, most likely African himself ethnicity, she raises up the example of Terence and asks why does he not get his just due? Why partial grace, as she says in line 39, to this one only of African's sable race? Why is he not among the first of the rolls of fame? Now, this is a thread throughout her poetry. She's one of the first examples of bringing in that history, also an expansive history of the Mediterranean that reaches beyond just Greece and Rome. Bowdoin's own John Russwurm, who's the first Black graduate of Bowdoin College, is another one to follow up on this legacy. In 1826, he sees the first Egyptian mummy to tour the United States. It's at Reuben Peale's New York Museum. And he takes that opportunity to write in the Freedom Journal, of which he is a founding member, a review of the exhibition that meditates on the fact that Egypt doesn't get its due in histories of the ancient world, and Egypt deserves more credit. And he's not wrong, because we know well that the Greeks and the Romans looked to Egypt as a birthplace of science and culture and held it in amazingly high regard. But in the early American Republic in Europe, the role of Egypt had been kind of, by this point, diminished. And this is something that Professor Tess Chicalacol has written extensively about, especially the case of Charles Chesnutt, who's a later figure and author whose diary of reading Homer in the early 20th century is another landmark in sort of Black American engagement with antiquity. Now, the other important thing, and this is where the Bowdoin family comes in, is that to get out in front of doubters of Phyllis Wheatley's story, the poetry is accompanied by a preface, a letter signed by Boston dignitaries, by prominent Bostonians, attesting to the fact that this is truly the work of an enslaved Black American. And among the signatories to this letter is James Bowdoin II. And it is perhaps for that reason, and this is published in 1773, that in 1775, Phyllis Wheatley dedicates to James Bowdoin II a poem on the capture of General Lee. Now, this is something I just encountered yesterday in Special Collections when Emily and I were going through Bowdoin's letter books. Ostensibly, it's a holograph copy of Phyllis Wheatley's poem, which would mean that she wrote this by hand and sent it on to James Bowdoin as part of the dedication. I'd love to dig in a little more to that. But in either case, dedicating this poem is to Bowdoin, and him being a signatory to this is an incredibly important point of connection there with the Bowdoin story. So, but Jefferson has a role to play in this as well.
Yes, he does. And the next slide that I'm going to show has some incredibly offensive language on it. So I want to say that before I present it, because it's difficult to read. Jefferson's only published book is called Notes on the State of Virginia, and it is a point-by-point rebuttal of a French naturalist named Comte de Buffon, who basically argued for American inferiority. He argued that America was degenerate. And Jefferson is trying to answer his arguments. And there are many queries. The query we're going to focus on is query 14. And in query 14, Jefferson makes his most public statements about that reveal his racism, reveal his belief or in his statements that contain his statements about the inferiority, mental and physical, of Black people. And I'm bringing this up because as he's describing music, dance, poetry, he names Phillis Wheatley by name. She is his named example. And he's, in this passage, he is not only dismissing her work as poetry. He says it's beneath contempt. You shouldn't even read it. And then he goes on to question her authorship. And so it's basically saying this shouldn't be read, nor could it have been produced by the person who is given credit for it. A little further down, he continues. He starts making some arguments about the experience of enslaved people in Rome being far worse than the experience of enslaved people in America. And it's Jefferson tying himself in knots to make this argument. But further down, he mentions Terence. As Sean has talked about, who Phillis Wheatley looks to as saying, why isn't Terence more celebrated? And Jefferson's argument is that Terence is okay because he's white. And he ignores the reality of Terence's African lineage, his Africanness, his Blackness. And the thing that's really difficult to deal with Jefferson, there's a lot of things that are really difficult to deal with Jefferson, but the thing that I think is really frustrating for modern people especially is that you read him turning himself into knots to make these arguments, because the arguments don't follow, they don't make any sense. But you also know that he's living surrounded by figures who embody Black excellence. He is surrounded by figures like John Hemmings, who is an enslaved carpenter, craftsman, joiner at Monticello, who with James Dinsmore builds this arch in 9 days as he's just learning the trade. Hemmings is about 23 years old in 1799, and he has been working in wood, starting with wheels, which are really difficult to build, in about 1793. So he's coming into his own as a master carpenter, and he's making these complicated forms at Monticello. And we know about John Hemmings, but Hemmings is representative of so many other people. And the reason that we know about Hemmings is because he wrote. Hemmings, at a later time, a few decades later, Hemmings goes down and basically does the complete interior woodwork for Jefferson's getaway house called Poplar Forest. It's about 90 miles south of Monticello. And Hemmings wrote back to Jefferson. There are about 12 surviving letters describing what he was working on, giving Jefferson updates. And in these letters, they're a wonderful thing because they reveal, to the point about language and the language of classicism that's happening with art and artists, Hemmings reveals himself to be fluent in the language of classical architecture, which is a very specific language. He's referring to cornices, he's referring to dentils, he's referring to architraves. These are not words in standard early 19th century English usage. This reveals, as Wheatley had engagement with the classics, so Hemmings had, at least in terms of architecture and building trades. And I wanted to show this because this is a cartouche from the map. Jefferson's father drew the map. It's basically the border between Virginia and North Carolina in 1751. This one was published in 1753. And in the cartouche, you can see the figure of a Black person right here and right here, two figures. These are the only known figures, these are the only known representations of Black people that we know that hung on the walls at Monticello. So in Jefferson's enormous art collection, it was almost universally white. And I put this up here and wanted to share this with you because of a recent project that we did. This summer, we engaged with a contemporary artist named Titus Kaffar, and we installed this portrait for about 3 weeks in Monticello's parlor. And to speak to presence and to speak to what it was like to change the conversation about Jefferson's installation of worthies and people that should be looked up to, leaders of the early American Republic, by placing this portrait, obviously a contemporary portrait of a well-dressed man seated, but his hands and face and hair rendered in tar. It was astonishing. Our guides were extremely well trained, but it really changed the narrative for members of the public. It really changed the narrative for visitors. They were able to see Black presence in Monticello through this contemporary art installation in ways that they really have trouble doing in our regular installations. And with that, I know that there's some really interesting connections to Bowdoin that.
Yeah. So, to pick up on some of the threads there, and particularly on the thread of slavery in the United States, one of the things that I think bears mentioning tonight, that in my experience at Bowdoin, is still relatively less known than perhaps it should be, is that on the one hand, we often think of New England as this bastion of liberty and abolition movement, but of course in New England, slavery existed as well in Massachusetts until 1781 when it was outlawed in the Constitution. And the Bowdoin family existed in Massachusetts before the Constitution was enacted. And the Bowdoin family did own slaves. They were enslavers. James Bowdoin II had a number of slaves in his household, enslaved people in his household throughout his life, and that means that James Bowdoin III grew up in a household with enslaved people. And so I think that this is a really important part of the story. And the other part of the story, the important thing about that, and I'm glad you brought up John Hemmings, is the way that thinking through the way that many Black Americans, and particularly enslaved Black Americans, for many such people, the ancient world was not engaged with by choice. It was to greater or lesser degree inflicted upon them. And there's no, to my mind, greater example of that than the names that many enslaved people bore in the United States throughout the institution of slavery. And just to bring this example home, in the Bowdoin family, we know of 3 enslaved individuals who had names that were given to them that were drawn from the ancient past. There's Darius, which is ostensibly drawn from the Persian king, who was written about in Herodotus. There's Polydorus, and then there's Caesar. And Caesar is a great example of a couple of things. For one, what does it mean to name someone who is not free? Caesar. Someone who ostensibly holds all the power in the world as the emperor. There's a sort of a very dark, almost, in fact, I think malicious nature and humor in naming an enslaved person after a Roman emperor. And there are other examples of this as well. But the case of Caesar is a really important one to spend a moment on too. And should warn you, it is a very disturbing account here too, because James Bowdoin II in the early 70s sends Caesar to his brother-in-law, who is the governor of Grenada, to sell him at auction, knowing that he will be used in the sugar plantations and to an almost certain early death. And he sends him because Caesar has committed the capital offense of, for lack of a better word, flirting with white women in Boston. And it's an incredibly powerful, difficult thing to know about James Bowdoin II and the Bowdoin family. And actually, we have this account, which is in Bowdoin's own hand, written to a friend of his, describing this incident. I don't have the original here. I'm actually on my way Friday to go to the Massachusetts Historical Society and try to find the original of this letter. And in the next version of this presentation, have it in Bowdoin's own hands from his letter book. But really a remarkable story. But this practice of naming and kind of this malicious humor that enslavers took in naming slaves, ironically after figures of liberty or power, these disempowered people, is something also that, I mean, Emily can talk about at Jefferson briefly.
Yeah, no, I mean, at Jefferson, so these are names of, Jefferson owned 609 people, and these are their names. And within this list, it's a pretty overwhelming thing to see this many people listed all together. And within this list, there's Juno, there's Caesar, there's Jupiter, there's Polydorus, there's Quilmena. What we've realized is that there are very few African names. On this list, I really find one. I find the name Quash, which has a West African association. And so the question that this raises for me is, we know that slavery is pervasive through the United States. We know that its efforts to diminish individuals and to diminish personalities. And what I have to wonder is, so many times we have records of enslaved people because of their enslavers. We have the plantation lists of names. What did people call themselves? How did people refer to themselves? And will there ever be a way to try to capture that information? Will there ever be a way to know, what the difference is between the slave owners' records and community practice? And I think it's a question that's worth asking. It's a question worth keeping in mind as you see lists of names, as you encounter people and you start to try to reckon their contributions and bring their contributions out of the shadows of slavery into greater knowledge and greater discussion.
Well, Sean and Emily, I want to thank you both for an incredibly thought-provoking discussion, an opportunity to think about some of the positive transformations that Bowdoin and Jefferson brought about in terms of their contributions to education, their contribution to the development of collections of art from which we still benefit, but at the same time helping us to begin to reckon with another dimension of the embrace of classical antiquity, which I think we have to understand as a dimension of the origins of our republic, a very uncomfortable and difficult relationship with race that continues, of course, to be something that we reckon with today. And I love this idea, Emily, of bringing forward the names of individuals who perhaps have not received the degree of attention that they deserve. Hearing about the role of the invisible architects, for example, at Monticello is incredibly poignant. So you've given us so much food for thought. This has been such a rich conversation. I'm mindful of the fact that it's been such a rich conversation. We have gone beyond the 1 hour mark, but this is going to be, I know, a conversation that we return to many times. We're delighted that it's been recorded. Although we're a bit past our time, I know that there are some wonderful experts in the audience, and I think maybe we could allow 1 or 2 questions if anybody would like to raise one. And if that's the case, we do have microphones set up simply so that your questions can be recorded as part of this event. So, yes, Stephen. Mm-hmm. And if you wouldn't mind, I know it does for us here in the audience, but it won't for listeners at home. Thank you so much.
Good. 2 quick questions. Hemmings, there was a slave that mothered a child of Thomas Jefferson. Was she related to the carpenter?
Absolutely. So you're talking about Sally Hemings, who was the mother of 4 children that were fathered by Thomas Jefferson. At least 4 children who lived. I should say at least 6 children were born. At least 2 died in infancy. And she was John Hemings's half-sister.
Wow.
She was born, her father was John Wales, and she was born before the family came to Monticello. John Wales was the father of Jefferson's white wife, Martha Wales Skelton. So Sally Hemings was Jefferson's wife's half-sister as well. She was also a half-sister to John Hemings, but John Hemings was born after the family came to Monticello.
Fascinating. And the last quick question or thought, the Ariadne sculpture, isn't that symbolic also of America? Because we were abandoned by Great Britain and we rapturously look to the future of Bacchus and the richness of that conjunction. I mean, isn't that kind of symbolic of post-colonial America?
I love the idea. I really do. I don't know that we have any references of either Jefferson or Bowdoin or others interpreting it that way, but there is something symbolic about it. What you allow me to say is that Jefferson and Bowdoin wouldn't have looked forward to a Bacchic or Dionysiac future like Ariadne had when she's abandoned on the island of Naxos in Greek myth, and Dionysius comes along, who's the god of Greek wine and revelry and losing control, and picks her up and marries her.
And I appreciate that remark, but the celebratory nature of it is evoked,
Yes.
possibly.
The way that figures like Bowdoin, it always I have to say that it always had to be, their enthusiasm for antiquity always had to be tempered in some way in order to fit in with the dominant sort of ethos in America of restraint, of not being like Europeans, too much like Europeans who take things to excess. So, that's why those portraits of Bowdoin on the Grand Tour with his frilly collar and Jefferson in his own
It's so
sort of
fascinating,
nappa
the
brown.
betwixt and between status of her.
Yep. It's there. I like it.
And I'll say, Stephen, I think that's the beauty of this artistic legacy, is that in fact it permits so many ways to interpret what we know about the past and perhaps to see facets in it maybe that weren't even visible then but become more obvious to us today. If there's one more question, we'll take it. But, oh yeah, we'll take one question, one final question.
Oh God, it's the pressure of the last question. So thank you both so much for that very fascinating talk. And I was just wondering, since you kind of ended it on the legacy of Thomas Jefferson, who in recent years that legacy has become even more contested than maybe it was historically. How, in your kind of curatorial philosophy and practice, have you found yourselves sort of grappling with kind of that history, and especially kind of in the present moment? And you had the one example, Emily, of the Titus Kaphar as being this intervention, and so I was just kind of wondering if you both had sort of more ideas or sort of projects or strategies like that for museums going forward.
I will say that we are trying. We're trying really hard because there's such important conversations to have, and these are the conversations that I want to have as a scholar, but they're also conversations that our visitors want to have. Our visitors want to see that Jefferson did a lot of really important good things, but is also a very, very, very conflicted figure. I think what visitors also want to see is they want to see the contributions of people like John Hemings. They want to know, as much as we can. And the records are difficult because there are few, but they want to see, how did enslaved people, what were the experiences of enslaved people? How did people feel? And that's hard to get to from a scholarly perspective, but I think that that's a place where really thoughtful installations are going. One of the things that we use when we're thinking about programs and about programming is putting it through a think, feel, do mantra. And so what do we want people to think as they're engaging with our exhibition? What do we want them to feel? And then what do we want them to do afterwards? And it's hard. It's a real challenge. But I think this is just what has to be done. So it was an honor to present. It was an honor to place that Titus Kaphar painting in Monticello. I really hope that we can continue to do work that inspires people to think, that engages people's curiosity, and helps people to try to see the past that maybe they think they already know all about in different ways.
But,
I hope
but
that
maybe
answered
they
your
but
question.
maybe they don't know as much as they think they do.
That's true.
I mean, so this is a great question. Come down to Boston tomorrow. I'm presenting at a conference on museums and social justice based on the work that we did here on Assyria to America and Antiquity to America, and the way that ancient art can speak to issues in the present. And just one quick example of that. I picked up on the issue of, already I kind of showcased some of the ways that the Bowdoin story could be made relevant, or could bear or should open a window onto other experiences of the ancient world in America here. But there were also pieces in Bowdoin's own collection that were very important for me to put on view, and other pieces that speak to this in the Boyd Gallery. One of them, so I talked about the Udon bust, the Greenough, and this idea of Americans being portrayed in the guise of ancients. And these are examples of Americans being very closely identified on a personal level with ancient models, ancient inspiration, ancient people. That is not exclusive to white males, and that was something that I put the Udon in the exhibition, the Greenough in the catalog, but also on the walls are 3 other portraits that make that point, one of which comes from the Bowdoin collection, and that is a portrait of the Reverend Samson Occam, who was a member of the Mohegan tribe, and it shows him in classical guise, and it actually predates the Udon portrait. It predates anything else in the exhibition from this perspective, and it's a piece that was collected by Bowdoin, James Bowdoin III or James Bowdoin II, by Nathaniel Smibert. And it shows him in classical guise because he learned Greek and Hebrew and Latin and was very proud of this fact. It was a way of leveling the playing field with white settlers and colonists for him. He learned it with Eleazar Wheelock. But we were standing in front of it earlier today and wondering about the circumstances of its commission and what then would it have been doing in James Bowdoin III's house. And I'm not aware of any testimony to that fact of how it was installed. In the exhibition, it's installed actually above Bowdoin's portrait, but in line with Bowdoin. And 2 other pieces in the exhibition, again, a key theme of the exhibition began with telling an expansive story of the ancient Mediterranean, not just the Greeks and the Romans, but Egypt, Cyprus, the ancient Near East as well, how it was an interconnected and diverse culture, and it went far beyond Greek and Romans. And early American collectors appreciated that too. But it became also to tell a more expansive story of the way that Americans engaged with antiquity. And so there's a wonderful print by John Sartain after a painting by Nathaniel Jocelyn that is a portrait of Singbe Pie, who led the Amistad revolt. And it shows him in the guise of an ancient Roman. And it was commissioned by a wealthy black abolitionist from Philadelphia in 1840 as sort of a way, something to circulate in the newspapers and increase public sentiment around the Amistad trial then in the Supreme Court. And then the last piece is a painting of an American woman from the late 19th century that is, I think, one of my favorite pieces in the exhibition by far, by Jerome, and she is in the guise of Sappho. Sappho, by the point at which she's being depicted as Sappho, Carolyn Sanders Truax is being depicted as Sappho by Jerome. Sappho is understood by Carolyn Sandra Truax and her contemporaries as a lesbian homoerotic poet and a feminist icon already in the late 19th century. So it is a bold portrait choice for an American woman to make in concert with Jerome. So there are ways you can use those things to bring in other stories.
And I think it's exciting to think about the forward-looking dimension of many of the artworks in this exhibition. Sean and Emily, thank you both so much for your wonderful contributions to this exhibition. Thank you all for your contributions to this conversation. I think Sean and Emily will be here for a moment or two if anybody would like to ask them questions privately. We thank you so much for being with us. Emily, Sean, thank you for sharing your expertise.